Max Keiser. Oh, yeah, we're in like week number 3 or 4 of the Trump administration, and the globe reacts. Markets are going up and down, depending on what country you're in and what industry you're talking about. Are there concurrent things happening, or are they at cross purposes? Are markets jiving with each other, or are they doing things that don't make any sense? Let's talk to Stacy.
Max, actually, when you spoke to Jim Rickards the other day, he mentioned the fact that nobody can understand Donald Trump. He speaks very confusedly, worse than anything that the Feds, so-called Feds, speak. Remember, Alan Greenspan had famously, been able to say all sorts of stuff but not say a single thing, kind of like Donald Rumsfeld. Well, here we have the Trump administration. He just met with Shinzo Abe. He's announcing huge investment in trains and high-speed rail, but on the other hand, we also see Japan dumping U.S. treasuries. So we're going to look at these articles. We're going to look into these headlines, dig into these headlines here. Obama wanted to be the high-speed rail president. It might be Trump instead. The Obama administration, they say, spent nearly $10 billion to improve passenger rail service across the country. While it accomplished that goal to some degree, it did not build the faster trains passengers can ride in Europe, Japan, and China. Trains in other countries they mentioned can go in excess of 200 miles per hour, whereas there's like one train that could go maybe 150 miles per hour, and then it often derails on the eastern seaboard in America.
Oh, yeah, well, the train system is woefully inadequate here in the U.S., that is for sure. These Amtrak trains are way out of... Why don't they just use Hyperloop? You've got Elon Musk. He's an entrepreneur right here in America. He's bringing Hyperloop to other countries of the world. I think you go something like the speed, half the speed of light or something. You can go so fast in a Hyperloop, you meet yourself on the way back. That's how fast you go in Hyperloop.
Of course, Hyperloop kind of sounds a little bit like sci-fi. It doesn't sound like it could possibly
It's sci-present. It's sci-present. And I'm not talking about the schmata down on 7th Avenue that can get you a nice 3-piece suit for $29.99. That's sci-present. No, this is the present. Sci-fi of the present.
I thought you were going to say Psy, the dancer, Gangnam Style.
Oh, Psy of the Gangnam Style. Oh, ha, 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 ha. How do you do that pony dance? I can never quite get the pony
You
part
never
of it.
do it right.
I never get it right.
But, by the way, I noticed that this van is like very 70s. That's the U.S. rail system.
That's it. It's
right
a hippie
there.
van from the 1970s. It goes about 45 miles an hour. It's great for smoking something in there, but it doesn't get you where you need to go and as fast as you can do it in Europe. You can get from all over Germany, Switzerland, France, Japan, lickety-split, fast. Why is the U.S. so behind? Why?
Well, let's look back at this article about the Obama administration had committed $10 billion to the U.S. infrastructure. It didn't get as much. $10 billion?
I know guys up in Harlem carry that in their sock. That's nothing. You can't get nothing with that.
Well, Trump has said he's going to commit $1 trillion to the infrastructure spend, a lot of it on high-speed rail, he says. But the question is, funding, though, remains a huge hurdle. Trump hasn't been very specific about how he'd pay for these investments, other than to say the private sector would have a more important role. Getting federal money could be difficult, as a Republican-led Congress is expected to look aggressively for ways to save money. If the private sector finances these, the cost will be quite high, I should imagine.
Right. Well, I believe the railway stocks in Japan were on a tear on this news, all
Yes.
trading a lot higher. So the market capitalization of that entire market's been on the defensive for years since it popped in the 1989 famous Nikkei Dow pop moment. Maybe they'll get it from Japan. Of course, why not? That's where America gets its money from anyway. Why not just have Mrs. Watanabe, the mythical Japanese investor? She can buy shares in American transportation system. It's like back in putting in the transportation system, you know, at the the railway boom. And we got the robber barons all over again. Why not have robber barons made out of railway boom? Except the robber barons will be Japanese housewives.
You mentioned the Japanese railway stocks, so we're going to turn to that headline because here's something that was not covered by the U.S. press, but was covered by markets. Prices signaled something that Trump had said, though when Trump said this, the media here ignored it in favor of other sort of silly little things, maybe something he tweeted or something about Nordstrom and his daughter. Trump promises fast trains, Japan's railway stocks soar. Something wasn't picked up by the U.S. media, though it was picked up by the hedge funds and other speculators. In his remarks, Trump mentioned high-speed rail in the U.S., and on Friday, Japanese stocks dealing with high-speed rail systems soared on huge volume, and even in China it happened. So he was speaking to the CEOs of major aviation networks in America, airlines, and what he mentioned to them is he said, as an example, some of you were saying yesterday to me that you go to China, you go to Japan. They have fast trains all over the place. We don't have one. I don't want to compete with your business, laughter, but we don't have one fast train. So here's Shinzo Abe. He comes over to the U.S. and he meets with Donald Trump. And of course, the domestic media, the Beltway media, just treats it as two heads of nations meeting. But Shinzo Abe gets to lobby on behalf of Japanese corporations, whereas the one domestic guy who could be the competition, Hyperloop's Elon Musk, he gets slaughtered by the Beltway media. How dare you meet with Donald Trump? How dare you do this? We're going to boycott you. And of course, he loses the business to Japan because of their hyper-screeching. Hyperloop, hyper-screech.
Look, no doubt about it. These are huge infrastructure projects, and what made America, the Iron Horse from coast to coast. Just watched that film, Once Upon a Time in America, I believe, or was that a secondary film? Oh, the one with Henry Fonda plays the bad guy, the Sergio Leone film. It's quite a remarkable film about the corruption and the robber barony of that era.
Dr. Michael Hudson does talk about in the 19th century when America built the railways up into the World War I sort of period. They did that in order to lower costs everywhere, not to increase costs, because it used to cost a lot to transport any goods out to the West. So they built those, they had those competitions with these private corporations, whoever had the best plan and the cheapest way to build the rail system, and then the government would come in and pay for it. But they wanted to lower the cost for how expensive it was to get goods out into the West. Now they want to do the opposite. If you're going to use private finance, it kind of raises the cost of transportation.
Well, we'll see if that's the case, because you do have the issue, therefore, of who owns these utilities, these transportation systems. Is it the government or is it a private enterprise? And when you have private enterprise involved, you have a possibility of an oligopoly and oligopolistic pricing, and pricing can move up. And if you have one rail system, it's like going to have an impact on prices, that's for sure. But he can't use purely public money because the U.S. has too much debt already of $20 trillion or so. So he's going to have to use some private money. And then you're going to back at a Sergio Leone film, Once Upon a Time in the West. I definitely remember it. That's the title of the film. Henry Fonda played the bad guy. And it's a spaghetti western. It had Charles Bronson, though. It didn't have Clint Eastwood, which makes it kind of interesting.
So here's the share price of Nippon Sharyo. That's the maker of these maglev trains in Japan.
Oh, yes.
Those Trump's words he spoke, the share price soared. As with everything Trump does, though, the share price did fall soon after. But, you know, there's a lot of euphoria that surrounds him in terms of basically investors get a little bit crazy. But I want to turn to another headline, because we've covered this at Japan. Shinzo Abe promises all this money to invest in the U.S. But then you see a headline like this: America's biggest creditors dump treasuries in warning to Trump. From Tokyo to Beijing and London, the consensus is clear. Few overseas investors want to step into the $13.9 trillion U.S. Treasury market right now. In Japan, the largest holder of treasuries, investors culled their stakes in December by the most in almost 4 years. The Ministry of Finance's most recent figures show. What's striking is the selling has persisted at a time when going abroad has rarely been so attractive. And it's not just the Japanese. Across the world, foreigners are pulling back from U.S. debt like never before.
Yeah, this is a big macro story. The biggest creditors of U.S. debt are pulling back, and the central banks are filling that void. They're stepping in. They're expanding the balance sheet of central banks like the Federal Reserve Bank. But if Japan is a net seller of U.S. debt, but at the same time they're making overtures to be making a big bet on the U.S. economy, those two things don't match up. The bond market, of course, is a lot bigger than a Donald Trump tweet. for one thing. So if you look at the money flowing in and out of the bond market, it would tend to indicate that confidence might be waning if you have so much selling of these U.S. treasuries. So there does seems to be a bit of a mismatch there.
Yeah, well, according to what the Bloomberg article says, they say that whether it's the prospect of bigger deficits and more inflation under President Donald Trump or higher interest rates from the Federal Reserve, the world's safest debt market seems less of a sure thing, particularly after the upswing in yields since November. And then there's Trump's penchant for saber rattling, which has made staying home that much easier. Maybe his tweets are bigger than, because remember, one of his tweets changed 30, 40 years of China policy, for example. That was one tweet, and it caused a huge stir. You notice that Trump has rolled that back significantly. He spoke to the Prime Minister of China before, he spoke to the President of China before his meeting with Shinzo Abe and promised that he believes in the one China policy and he won't betray that. So he's rolled that back. So his tweets could start a sell-off in the treasuries.
Well, was it Teddy Roosevelt who had speak softly and carry a big stick? I mean, Trump could speak like a loudmouth and publish a little tweet.
Yeah.
You know, but
tweet softly. He should tweet softly and shut.
Right. Well, he's got a Twitter policy, so this is the first time we've seen this kind of thing in any kind of setting anywhere where you've got 140 characters the size of a tweet really rollicking markets around the world, and apparently people in the closest advisors in Washington, D.C. are watching the Twitter stream more than the information they get in the White House directly itself. And this is a guy who's literally just running the country and running the world out of his pockets, like, you know, somebody who runs a corner candy store might do.
Well, anyway, I think you're the first person to ask that in any financial news media is why not Hyperloop? Because everybody's running with the whole high-speed train, and yay, Japan's going to give us some high-speed trains, and yay, maybe China will, and yay, France and Germany will. But what about the whole U.S. Hyperloop system?
Right, and Elon Musk is financed in part by the U.S. government, so why not put a share of Hyperloop in everyone's Social Security account? So when they retire, they have a nice share of equity in Hyperloop because it's a guaranteed winner.
And you wouldn't have to worry about the eminent domain sort of stuff.
That's
isn't
right.
That underground?
It's just pop a hole. And, well, eminent domain would be a factor, but
okay.
You're going so fast that nobody would have time to sue you. All right, well, stay tuned for the second half, a whole lot more.
Even if we cannot agree on Ukraine, even if we cannot agree on Syria, we ought to be able to agree on nuclear dangers to both of us, to both of our countries. We ought to be able to agree on taking actions and steps that lower those dangers. Those are in the interest of both countries. There's not a conflict there.
Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to go to Dr. Michael Hudson. He's the author of many books, but his latest book is J is for Junk Economics, A Guide to Reality in an Age of Deception. Michael Hudson, welcome back.
Good to be here, Max.
Michael, I wanted to ask you first about the subtitle of your book, A Guide to Reality in an Age of Deception. You wrote this before the notion of fake news was invented to explain Hillary Clinton's loss. What is the deception of which you write, Michael?
Well, before there was fake news, there was fake economics. And almost all of the terminology has been turned into euphemism. And it's a kind of Orwellian vocabulary that academics use, basically to explain trickle-down economics. The idea that the economy is growing if the 1% grows. And if all the growth goes to the 1%, that's still a growth in GDP, and so we're all better off. The whole idea of burying any distinction between productive and unproductive activity or earned income and unearned income, everything's jumbled together. And so it's as if the most productive people in the country, according to productivity indexes, are Goldman Sachs partners because they make more money than anybody else, even though the money they make is simply a transfer payment. That is, it's paid by the rest of the economy. It's a zero-sum activity. So what my book does is try to provide a vocabulary so that people can get through this fog of euphemism and not only fake news, but fake language and doublethink that passes for mainstream economics these days.
All right, well, you're speaking really in a way that I am very appreciative of, because for the past few weeks, during this period of fake news and talking about fake news, I've said repeatedly that before fake news, there is what I call fake prices, which is what you're calling fake economics. In other words, the economic bedrock on which the economy is built is faulty. You mentioned the GDP number, for example. This is an absolutely absurd way to measure the economy for many reasons, and yet it is the single greatest point of reference used to describe the economy, and yet it is junk. It's utter junk, right?
That's right.
All right, and you also mentioned this idea of transfer payments. You say Goldman Sachs, they make a lot of money, therefore they're the most productive in our economy, but they're literally transfer payments, or, as you've also written about, they act as financial parasites on the system. They're simply leeching cash that's printed in their own back room, paying themselves money that they themselves have printed and calling that some kind of productivity game. Now, did Hillary lose because of fake news or because of her fake neoliberal economic policies? Which came first in that instance, Michael?
I think fake economic policies. People realized that she was for the free trade agreement, which really is turning over all of the government deregulatory agencies to the corporations. They realized that somehow the program she was writing on, saying it's all good for the workers, what she meant was giving more money to Wall Street is good for workers. It's all going to trickle down. Moving industry abroad to foreign countries is going to be good for American workers, because now you can buy Chinese manufacturers cheaper at Walmart, but forget the fact that you don't have a job, which forces you to go to Walmart instead of Macy's, which is now going out of business because so many people can't afford to shop there anymore. So the whole idea that the economy is one single ball of wax dominated by the finance and real estate sector, which is most of the economy, and that the industry and commerce and labor are just a residual, has everything upside down. It literally turns classical economics inside out. And it's become sort of a travesty. And so my book sort of goes through the vocabulary and talks about privatization and all of the keywords and the slogans that are used, Stockholm Syndrome and zero-sum activity where nobody gains. And essentially, it's a means of criticizing all this and piercing this fog that the Hillary people and others use focus groups to see what kind of slogans can we have that'll make people vote for these policies that are actually just the opposite of what's in their self-interest.
Let's talk trade deals now. The first day in office, Trump killed the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade deal. Your thoughts on this? I think. What are your thoughts?
Well, it's very good that he killed this awful trade deal. What I worry about is that he's going to now go into bilateral agreements that is going to reinstate the investment deals so that if countries pass a consumer protection law or an environmental law that costs corporations money, the corporations can sue. I worry that Trump is going to save all of the worst aspects of this law in the bilateral deals he's trying to make with foreign countries. And given the fact that his entire cabinet seems to be from Goldman Sachs, one wonders how much he really cares about making jobs.
How worried should we be, Dr. Michael Hudson, if the worst elements of the Trump presidency, as we see so far, manifest themselves? How bad could it get?
There's no way of knowing until people begin to push back. What you'd get would be Trump essentially being as bad as Hillary. And he ran as a lesser evil, and it turns out that both of them may be equally awful.
All right, let's keep on this trade theme for a moment. Trump talks about renegotiating NAFTA. Is NAFTA or China into the World Trade Organization the bigger problem? Will ending NAFTA help the Rust Belt? So I guess this would be a similar answer in that, sure, he'll get rid of this deal, but if he brings in bilateral deals and keeps the worst elements, you have a bigger problem. Your thoughts?
I don't think ending NAFTA will help the Rust Belt at all. It'll tear up the linkages of the car industry that the auto agreement with Canada had put in place. But more important, the purpose of NAFTA for America was, number one, to let Mexico have the maquiladoras, the very low-wage labor, right along the border, but also to open up Mexico's market to American agricultural exports. And the result of NAFTA has been disastrous for Mexican agriculture. Low-price, subsidized American wheat and grain and soybeans have driven the farming in northern Mexico all out of business. And so if NAFTA were torn up, all of a sudden Mexico could rebuild its agriculture and actually feed itself instead of depending on the United States. So Mexico's balance of payments would improve very strongly. American farm exports would meet a glut. And the car industry would be completely dismantled with Canada and cause a crisis. So I don't see anything really happening there.
Let me give you a bit of a twist to what the common theme being positioned out there in the media. You mentioned Goldman Sachs a moment ago as having infiltrated the Trump administration. Another word that we could use there is they've hacked the Trump administration. They've hacked their way into the cabinet positions. And I'm just thinking here, going back to 1989, 1980, with the fall of the Soviet Union and the rise of Boris Yeltsin, you had Wall Street bankers hack their way into Russia, brought in neoliberalism, and they brought in the rise of the oligarchs, and they literally destroyed that country worse than it would ever have been destroyed without these guys. Should we, as Americans, be more worried about Goldman Sachs doing the same to America by hacking their way into the cabinet that they did in Russia in 1989, 1990, more than the so-called hacking that went on between Russia and the U.S.?
This is a great point you're making, Max. It looks like Trump is going to do to the United States what Clinton and the neoliberals did to Russia after 1991, to create a kleptocracy, a new oligarchy. Russia is the model of where the Trump administration seems to be going. Absolutely right. It's going to be privatization. It's going to be a huge giveaway of public land, of public rights. It's going to be deregulation. It's going to be a free-for-all. And one wonders where, in Russia's case, there was a huge population decline and an emigration. One wonders where the Americans are going to go after all of this.
Right. I mean, I guess listening to you, I get really into my own thoughts a little bit deeper because you're such a fantastic author. Your new book is J is for Junk Economics. I'm holding up a picture of it right now. I recommend people run out and buy it immediately. It makes a great St. Patrick's Day gift, by the way. But to stay on this theme, you've got Trump literally is the new Boris Yeltsin, who's a puppet of Wall Street bankers and global bankers, and to bring about a kleptocracy in America. And that's where the activism should be focused, not on the fake news of the alleged Russian hack. if anything, look at what happened to Russia, as you point out, in the 1991 period. And that's going to be repeated in the United States. Now, another big Trump policy is infrastructure. Is he going to, if he takes $1 trillion of taxpayer funds and delivers high-speed rail to America, isn't that going to cause inflation in this environment we've lived under for 30 years of low interest rates? And won't those rising interest rates then snuff out any attempt to continue on in the business model? What do you think of this?
I don't see the high speed coming to America. I don't see it raising interest rates because only the Fed is going to determine the interest rate level, and I don't see it inflationary. Here's the problem. In order to make a high speed rail, let's say along the Atlantic seaboard, you're going to need a right-of-way. The right-of-way you're going to have to tear out about an 80-foot wide strip on either side of the high-speed rail. That means huge public domain taking over the property that's built here. You'd have to build a separate roadway that doesn't have crossing gates for trucks and school buses to be caught in front of. There's already one wreck with fatalities every single year just between Washington and New York. And the job in doing this, just acquiring the property, is going to take, during the entire Trump administration, 4 years to do. And I just don't see it being practical. And my Chinese friends point out that, well, in China, they didn't have that problem. Their high-speed railway goes through what was farmland. And they could there's 30 feet on each side of the high-speed rail, and then there are highways on each side of it. So there's no crossings, nothing in the way. That's not how the American cities have been laid out, or the railroads have been laid out. So the situation geographically is so different here. And the same in California. It would have to go inland, all along the dry, warm area, not along the coast area, in order to cut through the farmlands, and they'd have to dig huge tunnels or bridges over all of these, the right-of-way. I just don't see it being done in any kind of a practical way.
All right, Dr. Michael Hudson, I'm going to have to leave it there. The book is called J is for Junk Economics. Highly recommended. Thanks for being on the show.
Thank you very much, Max. It's good to be here.
And that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacey Herbert. I'd like to thank our guest, Dr. Michael Hudson, with this latest book, J is for Junk Economics. If you want to reach us on Twitter, it's Keiser Report. Until next time, bye, y'all.